The Tomb of the Forgotten Stars. Prologue. The endless void out there beyond the stars lies a place where time doesn't exist, where souls drift, lost in an endless expanse, never to be seen again. A cold, black sea of nothingness, swallowing ships and dreams alike. They call it the Tomb of the Forgotten Stars, a galaxy that has become a graveyard for the lost and the cursed. No one knows how many ships have ventured in, and never returned. But the whispers are enough to freeze your blood. That once you enter, there is no leaving. You'll be swallowed by the darkness, consumed by the spirits of those who came before you, until you too are a forgotten echo drifting in the endless abyss. But still, some dare, some seek redemption, a way to escape, the endless void. Chapter 1. The descent Lira stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the starless horizon. Her hands trembled over the controls, but her resolve was firm. This was her last chance. The galaxy had forgotten her, cast her aside like so many others. But the tomb offered one thing that no one else could, a way out. Engaging the descent sequence, Lira murmured, her voice barely audible over the ship's hum. Around her the crew was silent, each member gripped by fear. They were veterans of deep space travel, but nothing could prepare them for this. Nothing could prepare them for what waited in the void. The ship's engines fired, and the familiar hum shifted to a deep, resonant growl. Lira watched as the stars ahead dimmed, one by one, swallowed by an unnatural darkness. They were entering the tomb now. The air felt heavier, thicker, colder. What's that? Tarek, the navigator, pointed at a flickering light on the monitor. It blinked on and off, faint and distant, as if calling to them. Lira's heart pounded, a distress beacon, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen. Ancient, faint. This is, she whispered, the beacon of the lost. Her crew exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew the stories. The ones who followed those beacons never came back. But they couldn't turn back now. There was no other choice. With a swift motion, Lira activated the communications. This is the ship Eclipsed Dawn, requesting any response to the distress signal. Over. A static-laden voice crackled back through the speakers. At first, it was too distorted to understand, but then a single word came through, chilling and unmistakable. Help. The voice was faint, almost, drowned in static, but it was there. And it was enough to make the hairs on the back of Lira's neck stand up. Who was out there? What had happened to them? And why was the tomb calling them? Lira's pulse quickened as she adjusted the ship's course, heading straight toward the flickering signal. But as they drew closer, the darkness seemed to press in, a thick, suffocating blanket. We're getting closer, Tarek said, his voice tight with worry. Lira nodded, trying to steady her breathing. The truth was, they were entering the heart of something far more terrifying than they had anticipated. In the tomb, the laws of reality twisted and bent. Ships had disappeared here for millennia. No one had ever come back. The tomb wasn't just a graveyard. It was a prison, one that trapped the living and the dead alike in a never-ending cycle of torment. And they were about to discover just how true that was. Chapter 2. The echoes of the past. The ship's artificial gravity shuddered as they descended into the black void. Lira's hands gripped the helm with a vice-like intensity, but her mind was elsewhere. Help. The message had been clear enough, but the tone was something else. Weak, almost as if the voice had been pulled through decades of static. Lira. Tarek's voice broke through her thoughts, heavy with hesitation. We're nearing the source, but something's off. Lira didn't need him to elaborate. She could feel it too. The very fabric of reality seemed to stretch and snap like a broken thread. It wasn't just the absence of stars that felt unnatural, but the air, the space itself. Like they were no longer in the galaxy they knew, but something that had been corrupted. Steady, Lira commanded. Take us in slowly. She had been in dark regions of space before, but this was different. This wasn't simply a place lost to time. It felt alive. The tomb itself pulsed with a strange energy, as if something beyond comprehension was watching them, waiting. As they drew closer to the origin of the distress signal, the ship's lights flickered, dimming to a low, eerie glow. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, each of them knowing what the legend said, what the old myths told of those who ventured too far into the tomb. The ghost ships, the lost souls, the ones who never returned. It was as if the very air inside. The ship was thick with the whispers of the dead. Suddenly a shudder ran through the hull. The entire ship jolted, as if something had struck them from the outside. "Report!" Lira barked, her voice sharp with urgency. "Nothing on the scanners," Tarek replied, his face pale. "But I don't know, Lira. Something doesn't feel right." Before she could respond, the communications system crackled again. This time, the voice was louder, more urgent. "Please, help us." Lira leaned forward, focusing on the faint image on the screen. A blurry, flickering image of a ship. It was massive, derelict, and ancient, with debris floating around it like a halo of decay. The hull was scorched, blackened by the passage of time, but there was something about it that struck her. Something familiar. "I don't know," Lira muttered, barely above a whisper. "But that ship, it looks like an Elysium-class ship," Tarek interrupted, his voice a mix of disbelief and awe. "They haven't been in service for over 200 years. Lira's eyes widened. The Elysium-class was one of the most advanced ships ever built, a marvel of old-world technology, and it had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The kind of ship that shouldn't be here, in the tomb. But there it was, and it was the source of the distress signal. She tightened her grip on the console. "Set a course for the ship. We're going to board." "No way," Tarek said, shaking his head. "We don't even know what happened to them, Lira. This could be a trap. It's—" "Set the course, Tarek." Lira cut him off, her voice. "Dradigi and we've come this far. If we turn back now, we're as good as dead." Reluctantly, Tarek nodded and input the new coordinates. The ship lurched again as they moved toward the wreck, the artificial gravity flickering in and out. As they approached, the distress signal grew clearer, more distinct, yet there was something in the tone, a desperate urgency that made Lira's chest tighten. It was as if the voice was reaching out not just for rescue, but for revenge. "Almost. There," Tarek said. "But something's wrong with the gravity well. It's fluctuating." Lira barely registered his words. Her eyes were locked on the derelict ship ahead, its silhouette becoming clearer as they drew near. The entire vessel was surrounded by a field of debris, shattered pieces of metal, and twisted remnants of what had once been advanced technology, now corroded and broken by time. "Prepare to dock," Lira ordered, her voice low and steady. The crew scrambled to secure their positions, tension thick in the air. She didn't need to look at them to know they were all thinking the same thing. The tomb didn't give up its secrets easily, and anyone who came this far was either cursed or about to become part of the graveyard. The ship inched forward, docking clamps extending and latching onto the derelict. The docking bay doors hissed open, revealing a pitch-black hallway stretching deep into the heart of the vessel. "Stay sharp," Lira ordered, her voice a razor's edge. "We don't know what we're walking into." They stepped out, weapons raised. The silence that greeted them was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's emergency systems. As they moved deeper into the bowels of the derelict, the air grew colder, thicker, stale, like it hadn't been breathed in centuries. And then, they found it. The bridge of the Elysium-class ship. The room was exactly as it should have been, except for the bodies. At first, Lira thought they were frozen in place, but as she stepped closer, she saw their eyes. Wide, staring, but empty. They were dead, long dead. Yet their forms remained intact, suspended in some unnatural state of preservation. The air around them buzzed with static, as if their very presence was disrupting the space. Tarek took a step back. "This isn't right," he whispered. Lira nodded, her stomach twisting, but she couldn't pull away, Not now. Not when they had come so far. This ship was here long before we got here, she murmured. And whatever happened to these people, it's still here. Suddenly a low growl reverberated through the walls, vibrating the very air. The lights flickered. For a moment, Lira thought she saw something, a shadow moving just at the edge of her vision. And then the whisper began. It was faint at first, like a distant voice echoing in a vast, empty space. But it grew louder, closer. The sound of a voice, low and desperate, a wail of something trapped. "Help us," it hissed. "You're too late." The words cut through the silence like a blade, sending a chill down Lyra's spine. "We need to go," Tarek said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Now, something's wrong with this place." Lira shook him off. "We can't leave, not yet." But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. The tomb had already begun to claim them. Chapter 3. The pulse of the tomb. The whispering voices grew louder with each step they took. At first, Lira thought it was the hum of the ship's malfunctioning systems, static-laden distortions from decades of neglect. But as she pressed forward, to the center of the derelict bridge, the voices became clearer. They were no longer just faint echoes, but full-throated cries, wails, and desperate pleas. "Help us. Help us. You're too late." Tarek's grip on Lyra's arm tightened, his voice barely a whisper. "Lira, we need to leave. This place is alive. It's feeding on us." Lira shook her head, the cold dread crawling up her spine. "No, we came this far. We have to find out what happened here. We can't leave without answers." Her voice cracked at the end, betraying the fear that had begun to creep into her bones. The ship was ancient, but it wasn't empty. She felt it in the air, like the stillness was a lie, a deceptive calm hiding something far darker. The bodies were still frozen in place, their wide eyes staring into nothingness. They had been alive once. Lira could tell by the way they were arranged in their seats, stiff but purposeful, like they had been frozen in time the moment something horrific occurred. Their hands were still clutching the control panels, but their expressions told a different story. Fear, panic, desperation. "What happened to them?" Tarek asked, his voice shaky. "Why are they still here? Why haven't they decayed? How?" Lira didn't answer. She knew the truth as much as he did. They weren't simply dead. They were trapped, stuck in some eternal limbo. The tomb didn't let go that easily. The air shifted. It was subtle at first, just a strange weight, like the ship had drawn in a deep, quiet breath. But then a new sensation gripped Lira, a tingling at the back of her skull, a pressure in her chest. Something was reaching out. She could feel it, like invisible hands brushing against her mind. A low rumble echoed through the walls of the ship. "Lira." Tarek's voice cracked as the lights flickered again. "We should go. I don't know what's happening here, but it's not safe. We can't trust this place. This ship." But Lira was already moving toward the central console. The blinking lights on the ship's control panel were the only things providing some faint illumination in the darkness. There was a strange glow emanating from beneath the dust and debris, as if the ship's systems were still alive, still pulsing with energy, despite its ancient age. They were here. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Lira froze. She could feel her breath catching in her throat. The voice, it was like the ship itself was speaking to her. They were here, and now, you are here. Lyra's pulse quickened. She looked around the room, but the source of the voice was elusive, like an echo that refused to die. She had heard the stories of the tomb, the spirits that lingered, the entities that haunted the dead ships, but nothing had prepared her for. This nothing could prepare her for the feeling of being so intimately connected to the ship, like it had become a part of her. They, Lira murmured to herself. They were trapped too, just like the others. Yes, the voice answered. Trapped, but still here. Tarek backed away slowly, his breath shallow. Lira, whatever this is, it's not natural. These aren't just ghosts, Lira. This is something else. Something hungry. The words sent a shiver through Lira, but she refused to back down. This was what they had come for. They couldn't leave without uncovering the truth. Her hand hovered over the ship's central terminal, fingers trembling. "Please don't," Tarek whispered, his eyes wide with fear, but it was too late. Lira pressed a button. The console clicked in response, and the room was immediately flooded with data. Streams of light erupted from the terminals, bathing the room in a sickly glow. Hollow screens blinked to life, showing fragmented records, broken files, and desperate logs. Most of it was corrupted, lost to the ravages of time. But one file remained intact, a single word visible through the haze: Eclipse. She gasped. The Eclipse wasn't just a ship. It was an experiment, a project lost to the universe. She had heard the stories from the old archives, a project that sought to explore the deepest, most forbidden regions of the galaxy. But the project had gone wrong. Very wrong. "Lira, stop!" Tarek shouted. But it was too late. The file began to open, revealing the horrors within. As the data streamed into her mind, a flood of images overwhelmed her. Screams, faces twisted in agony. People, no, creatures, shaped by the tomb itself, their bodies contorted, their minds shattered by the endless void. Lira staggered back, her vision blurring. She tried to shut the terminal down, but the ship resisted. The tomb wasn't letting her go. "They sought to control us," the voice whispered again, this time clearer. "They thought they could tame the abyss. But the abyss consumes. It consumes all." A sudden, sharp pain pierced Lira's head. She dropped to her knees, clutching her temples as the voice filled her thoughts. It wasn't just speaking to her now. It was inside her mind, inside her very soul. They are all here. Their bodies. Their soul trapped. Images flashed before her, horrible, horrific images. The faces of the lost crew, staring at her through hollow eyes, their bodies twisted and frozen in the eerie calm of death. They were still here, still alive, in some unfathomable way, unable to escape the grip of the tomb. Lira gasped for air. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. Tarek was calling her name, but his voice seemed so far away. She was drowning in the tomb's pulse, its hunger for more. "You are part of it now," the voice whispered. "You will never leave." With a violent jolt, Lira snapped back to reality. She stumbled to her feet, the pain in her head subsiding, but the cold, unsettling presence of the tomb still lingered. The room had gone silent again, but something had changed. The ship was no longer just an abandoned vessel. It was a sentient entity. It was alive, and it had marked them. Tarek grabbed her arm. "Lira, we have to go, now." Lira nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't leave either. Not without knowing what had really happened. The ship, the tomb, it was holding them here for a reason. The pulse of the tomb seemed to shift. It was waiting, watching. As Lira and Tarek turned to leave the bridge, a low hum filled the air, and the doors to the bridge slammed shut. The ship had locked them inside, and then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but they were not their own. Chapter 4. The Haunting. The footsteps were still echoing through the dark corridors of the ship, each one louder than the last. The hairs on the back of Lira's neck stood up as she turned slowly, searching the shadows for the source. She could feel the weight of the tomb pressing in on her, the cold, palpable sense of watching eyes from the very walls. Tarek, his breath ragged and shallow, gripped her arm with desperation. "This place, it's alive. We're not alone." Lira nodded, feeling the unsettling truth of his words settle into her gut. They had known the tomb was a place of lost souls, a graveyard of ships and crews who had vanished into the blackness. But this was something else. The ship was no longer just a hollow husk. It was a sentient force, a predator, drawing them deeper into its grip. "Stay close," Lira whispered, pulling Tarek toward the nearest exit. Her pulse thundered in her ears as they moved, every step feeling like it was being watched. The flickering lights overhead buzzed in sync with her heartbeat. casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with them. They reached the narrow corridor that led deeper into the bowels of the ship. It was even colder here, the air thick and oppressive. The faintest trace of moisture clung to the walls, as if the very metal was sweating in fear. Lira's boots echoed against the floor, but the sound was swallowed quickly by the vastness of the ship. No matter how far they ran, it felt like they were still within the same place, a labyrinth that never ended. "What is this place?" Tarek asked, his voice breaking the silence. How could something this old, this abandoned, be so alive? Lira didn't have an answer. She didn't want to think about it. The data she had seen on the central terminal had been enough. Eclipse had been a military vessel, part of a top-secret project designed to explore the outermost reaches of the galaxy. But the project had been a failure, a catastrophe. They had attempted to harness the power of the tomb itself, to control the void, to manipulate the very fabric of space and time. But it hadn't gone as planned. Lira had seen the pictures. The crew had suffered in ways that were beyond human comprehension. Some of them had been twisted beyond recognition, their bodies contorted into shapes no living thing could endure. Others had disappeared. The files were clear, no one had ever returned. What happened to the crew? Tarek's voice broke into her thoughts. Where are they? They're here, Lira said, her voice cold. This ship is their grave. The tomb doesn't just claim bodies, Tarek, it claims souls. Tarek's grip tightened. You mean, the crew? They're still in here? Lira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pushed forward, her boots scraping against the metal floor. The walls seemed to narrow around them as they ventured deeper into the ship. The corridor stretched ahead, its end swallowed by darkness. Yet, somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the faintest sound of breathing. Lira, Tarek said, his voice tight with fear. We need to get out of here. This place, it's calling us. I can feel it. It's trying to pull us in. She didn't respond at first, not because she didn't hear him, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them. Something beyond the ship. Something that had been waiting for them all along. The air grew heavier as they reached a larger room. It was a cargo bay, or at least that's what the schematic had shown on the central console. But now it was nothing more than a vast open cavern of rusting metal and twisted wreckage. In the center of the room was a flickering light, casting a pale glow on the floor. It was coming from something, no, someone, lying on the ground. Lira's pulse quickened. Who's there? Tarek took a step back, his body tense, but Lira didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her boots crunching on the metal. As she drew closer, the figure began to stir. It was a person. No, a corpse, but not entirely lifeless. It lay on the floor, its body grotesquely twisted, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and stretched thin, its eyes wide, open, staring at nothing. But it wasn't entirely dead, not yet. Lira's breath caught in her throat as the thing slowly raised its head, its eyes locking with hers. Please, the figure rasped, its voice distorted and broken. Please, don't leave us, don't let it take you. Lira froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was a voice she had heard before, in the data logs, in the fragmented video files from the ship's last moments. This was one of the crew members. The figure stretched its arms out toward her, fingers twitching, but it couldn't move. It was trapped in the same state of eternal limbo as the others. It was as if the ship had stopped time, trapping their souls in a state of endless suffering. Lira took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. What happened to you? She whispered, unable to look away from the creature's tortured expression. The figure's mouth opened, but the words that came out weren't human. They were whisper. A soft, rasping sound that reverberated through her mind. They sought to control us. They thought they could tame the tomb, but the tomb devours. It devours everything. Tarek gripped Lira's arm tightly, pulling her away. We need to go, now. But the figure wasn't finished. Its voice grew louder, more insistent. You don't understand. You can't escape. The tomb never lets go. Once it has you, you're its forever. Lira shook her head, her mind reeling. She had to understand, she had to know. This ship had been an experiment, an attempt to control the tomb. But what had gone wrong? What had happened to the crew? Why were they still here, trapped in the ship's hollow grip? Lira took a deep breath, stepping forward again. What happened to you? Tell me everything. But the figure's eyes widened in horror. It started to scream, but the sound was muffled, distorted. It twisted violently, its body spasming in unnatural ways. And then, it fell silent. For a moment, Lira thought it was dead again. But then the light from above flickered once more. And she saw it. More figures, more bodies lying in the shadows watching her. They were waiting. They were all waiting for something. Her. The air grew colder still, and the temperature dropped. The ship seemed to groan under the weight of the darkness that pressed in from every side. Lira's breath came in shallow gasps. As she turned toward Tarek, "We need to leave," he said urgently. "We need to go, Lira, before it's too late." But Lira didn't move. She was staring at something. No, someone in the far corner of the room. A figure. It was a person, standing perfectly still in the dark. Its face was hidden in shadow, but it was staring at her. There was something about it, something familiar. She could feel it in her bones. "No," Lira whispered, her voice faltering. "No, it can't be." But the figure stepped forward into the light, revealing its face. It was her, not just anyone. Her. Lira's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak, and then the voice whispered again. "The tomb takes everything, and you are next." Chapter 5. The mirror of souls. Lira's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the figure that stood before her in the shadows. Her face, the face she saw staring back at her from the dark, was hers. But it wasn't. There was something wrong about it, something off about the way her reflection stood. Its eyes empty of life, its mouth twisted into a sneer. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Lira's breath caught in her throat as it stepped into the light, revealing more of its face. It was her face, but the eyes, those eyes, they were darker, hollow, filled with a kind of madness that Lira had never seen. Tarek was beside her now, his voice shaky as he whispered, "Lira, what is that? Is it you?" Lira shook her head, her mouth dry, unable to speak. The figure was imitating her, mimicking her every movement, but there was an unsettling wrongness to it. The way it tilted its head, the unnatural twitch of its fingers, it was as if the tomb had crafted this twisted reflection of her. The air grew heavier, suffocating. It was like the ship had drawn a breath in, a silent exhale that seemed to resonate. In her chest, Lira could feel the pulse of the tomb again. It was alive, aware, and waiting. Her reflection, or whatever it was, smiled at her, a jagged grin that sent a cold chill down her spine. "I see you, Lira," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "I've been waiting for you." Her stomach churned, the hairs on her neck standing on end. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the reflection. It spoke her name, and the way it whispered it was like a secret she wasn't meant to hear. It knew her. It knew her more than she wanted to admit. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, she felt an overwhelming pull, as if the figure were reaching out for her, beckoning her into its embrace. "You belong to me now," it whispered, the words seeping into her consciousness like a slow poison. Lira stumbled back, her breath ragged, the fear gripping her heart. No, that's not me. That's not who I am." But the reflection in front of her laughed, its face contorting into a grotesque parody of her own expression. The sound was like nails scraping across metal, unnatural and jarring. "Is not Lira? You are a part of me now. The tomb claims all who enter, and soon you will understand." Tarek took her arm, his voice urgent. "Lira, we need to leave. This is not real. This is just another trick, another illusion." But Lira couldn't pull her eyes away. Was it real? The figure, the voice, the feeling. It was all so real. It was her. And yet it was a twisted version of her, something that the ship had created, something that the tomb had made. "You're here to join us," the voice echoed around them, its tone reverberating through the walls of the ship, curling around their minds. The spirits of the lost crew were calling to them now, their voices rising in a chorus of grief and sorrow. Tarek grabbed her wrist, trying to pull her away, but she was rooted to the spot. Her reflection, her twisted double, stepped forward. Closer now, its empty eyes fixed on her with predatory intent. "You will be one of us soon, Lira." The words seeped into her skin like ice water, freezing her thoughts. The longer she looked at the reflection, the more she felt herself slipping away. It wasn't just the ship that was trapping them. It was the tomb itself, feeding off their fears, their confusion. She could feel it pulling at her, pulling her toward something darker, something more ancient than she could comprehend. "No," Lira whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I will not become one of you." But the reflection didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching her with an empty gaze, its lips curling into a smile that didn't belong. Tarek yanked her away from the figure, dragging her down the corridor. "We have to move, now, before it gets to you." But Lira could still hear the whispering voice of the reflection in her head, echoing with each step they took. "You can't. Run from yourself, Lira. The tomb has already claimed you." The walls seemed to close in around them, the corridor narrowing as they ran. The pulse of the ship grew stronger, the air thick with the pressure of something watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They reached a junction, but it was empty. Just another stretch of endless, lifeless hallways. Tarek's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. "Lira, listen to me. We need to get to the shuttle. We can't stay here. We need to leave this place." Lira nodded, her thoughts clouded. The whispers from the tomb, the reflection, everything seemed to be closing in on her. She felt like she was losing her grip on what was real. But then another sound reached her ears. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Tarek froze. "Did you hear that?" Lira nodded, her heart racing. She turned to look behind them, but the corridor was empty. Yet the footsteps persisted, soft, steady. They were getting closer. "I don't understand," Tarek murmured. "There's no one here. No one could be here." But Lira didn't answer. She was staring at something, someone, standing in the distance. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, moving toward them with purpose. It was another reflection, another ghost. Of the past. This one didn't speak, but its presence was enough. Lira could feel its eyes on her, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. "We need to go," Tarek insisted, his voice rising in panic. "We can't stay here. This place is feeding on us." But Lira was already moving toward the figure. "Lira!" Tarek shouted, grabbing her arm, but it was too late. The figure reached out to her, its hand brushing against her cheek in a slow, deliberate motion. The chill of its touch sent a shockwave through her, freezing her in place. And then she heard its voice. "You are part of the tomb now, Lira. You belong to us." A sharp pain lanced through her head, and she collapsed to the ground, clutching her temples. Her mind seemed to tear apart, the whispers of the tomb rising in volume, drowning out everything else. She could feel herself being pulled into the very core of the ship, deeper and deeper into the tomb's grasp. Tarek knelt beside her, his voice frantic. "Lira, Lira, stay with me. You can't let it take you." Lira's breath came in ragged gasps. I don't know what's real anymore." The figure towered over her, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "None of you are real. You are all fragments, echoes, lost souls." And then everything went dark. Chapter 6. Into the abyss. The darkness suffocated her. Every breath felt heavy, laden with the oppressive weight of the tomb, its cold fingers pressing against her lungs, tightening with each passing second. Her eyes fluttered open, and the world spun into focus, the metal walls of the Eclipse stretching out like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The chill in the air stung her skin, a biting reminder of the hollow ship surrounding her. Lyra's body ached, her muscles sore from the tension of her own fear. She tried to move, but her limbs were stiff as if the tomb itself had frozen her in place. A voice echoed in her mind, one that she had heard before, but now, it seemed, closer, more real. "You cannot escape," it whispered. A serpentine hiss that slid through her thoughts like a parasite. "You belong to us now." The voice was familiar. It was the voice of the figure, the reflection that had tried to claim her in the previous chamber. But it was also something more, something ancient, a presence that had been in the ship long before she had ever stepped aboard. Lira took a deep breath, willing her body to move. Her head throbbed, a dull ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. She had to get up. She had to keep going. Tarek, where was Tarek? Her eyes snapped open, searching the dark room she found herself in. She was lying on the floor of what appeared to be some sort of command center. The walls around her were lined with old, rusting consoles and flickering screens, their displays full of static and corrupted data. Yet there was one terminal that was still glowing, its faint green light cutting through the gloom like a lighthouse in a storm. She pushed herself to her feet, her knees buckling slightly under her weight. The chill in the air was becoming unbearable now, and the silence was deafening. The only sound she could hear was the soft hum of the ship's failing machinery, the low moan of the ship's bones creaking and groaning in the darkness. "Tarek?" she called, her voice hoarse. It came out as more of a croak, barely audible against the oppressive quiet. "Tarek, where are you?" There was no response. She moved toward the console, her legs unsteady, and tried to focus on the screen. The faint green light illuminated the words scrolling across it, but it was distorted, corrupted. She couldn't make sense of any of it. The language wasn't even in a format she recognized. Whatever had happened to this ship, it had bent the very fabric of reality itself. And then, as if it were waiting for her to touch it, the screen flickered, and the words changed, rearranging themselves before her eyes. "You cannot escape," the terminal spat out, the letters flashing in bright red, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by a row of static. Lira stumbled backward, her breath coming faster now. She wasn't alone here. Not anymore. She could feel it, that presence, the something that had been watching her since she boarded the Eclipse. The ship wasn't just a tomb. It was a predator, and she was the prey. Her mind flashed back to the reflection she had seen, the twisted double of herself, the words it had whispered, "You belong to us now." They were starting to make sense now, in the way only the tomb could make sense. It consumed. It didn't just claim bodies, it bent reality itself, corrupting everything it touched. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the console, trying to find something, anything that could help her make sense of this nightmare. She was losing herself, slipping into the same void that had swallowed so many others. There was a sudden noise behind her, and Lira spun around, her heart racing. But when she turned, there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the twisted shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. "Lira." She froze. That voice, the voice of the reflection, the one that had tormented her earlier, now whispering her name in a soft, seductively low tone. It sounded so real, so close, as if it were right next to her, whispering into her ear. "Lira. You can't escape. Get out of my head," she screamed, her voice raw, filled with desperation. But the voice only grew louder, as though it were all around her now. Everywhere. "You can't escape the tomb." Her hands flew to her ears, but the voice sank deeper, its words now clawing at her mind. She could feel her sanity slipping, her thoughts unraveling as the ship's dark influence took hold of her. The walls around her seemed to warp, twisting, in on themselves like the interior of some massive living creature. "You are part of us now." "No!" Lira shouted, shaking her head as if she could physically push the voice out of her mind. "No, I'm not. I won't be." But the laughter that followed sent chills racing down her spine. "You are nothing but a memory now." She collapsed to the floor, clutching her head in her hands. The weight of the ship's influence was too much, too overwhelming. Her vision blurred, her body shaking as the shadows around her began to take shape. Figures, faces, tortured and twisted, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Lira tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the ship. The figures didn't move. They simply watched her, waiting. The air grew thick with their presence, their whispers merging into a cacophony of voices that drowned out her thoughts. We are the lost. We are the forsaken. We are the souls of the tomb. Lira stumbled to her feet, her knees weak. She couldn't stay here, not like this. She had to fight back. She had to break free from this nightmare. But then the figure, the one she had seen in the reflection, stepped forward again, its eyes empty and dark, its lips twisted into that grotesque grin. It's too late. No! Lira screamed, pushing herself away from the figure, her hands trembling with fear. Suddenly the room around her shifted again. The walls began to stretch and bend, the floor underneath her feet tilting at a horrifying angle. The figures, the souls, grew, in number surrounding her now. Their faces were distorted, their bodies mangled. They reached out toward her with hands that seemed to stretch endlessly, their fingers like hooks, seeking to drag her down into the ship's maw. "We are you, Lira. No!" she shouted again, her voice breaking. "I am not you. I'm not part of this." But the voices only grew louder, echoing through the very core of the ship. The tomb was taking everything inside her, and she was losing herself. She was becoming them. With a final scream of defiance, Lira reached out toward the central terminal once again, her fingers pressing against the cold metal surface. And just like that, the voices stopped. The ship, the souls, the oppressive, darkness, it all went silent. She gasped for air, her vision clearing. The room was still, unnaturally still, and she was alone. But then, she saw it. The terminal screen flickered back to life, this time showing only one word: survive. Chapter 7. Fractured minds. Lira's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the glowing words on the terminal screen. Survive. The word felt like a command, a cold, hollow, almost mocking demand. The tomb had been watching her, manipulating her every move. She had been walking through its maze of whispers and shadows for what felt like days, but now, the ship was silent. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew better. The tomb didn't offer hope. It only offered eternal torment for those who dared to enter. Survive, she muttered, running her fingers over the terminal's screen as if to touch the word, to somehow understand what it meant. The text blinked again, flickering, and then the screen went dark, leaving her in the same oppressive silence that had filled the ship since she first arrived. Tarek's face flashed in her mind, his worried expression frozen in the last moments. She'd seen him. Had he been lost to the tomb already? Or was he still somewhere in the ship trying to find a way to escape this madness? Her heart tightened at the thought, the guilt creeping in, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to be weak. She had to survive, whatever it took. Tarek. She whispered his name into the empty room, her voice trembling. The echoes of the ship seemed to absorb her words, muffling them into nothingness. Had he heard her? Could he hear her through the maze of corridors and darkness that surrounded them? Lira had to find him. She had to find a way to break free. She glanced back at the terminal, but there was nothing more to glean from it. The ship was alive in some sense, constantly shifting. Even the simplest machines, like the terminal, seemed to bend reality itself, warping and changing in impossible ways. There was no telling what was real anymore. The voices were gone, at least for now. They had faded into the walls, slipping back into whatever dark recesses they had come from. The oppressive atmosphere that had followed her since she first boarded the Eclipse seemed to have lessened slightly, though she knew it was merely a fleeting reprieve. Focus, Lira murmured to herself. She had to focus. The ship might be trying to break her mind, but she couldn't let it. Not yet. She turned away from the terminal, moving toward the dimly lit exit. The walls around her seemed to shift again, faintly shimmering as though reality itself were warping around her. Every step she took felt like walking on the edge of a blade, her senses on edge, attuned to the slightest movement in the shadows. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, the faint blue light flickering above her like the dying glow of some distant star. Tarek's voice, a soft echo, drifted back to her. "Lira, are you okay?" She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. She could swear she heard his voice, a whisper in the wind, faint but undeniably familiar. Was it real? Was he here? Or was it just another trick of the tomb? "Tarek?" she called into the darkened corridor. Her voice reverberated, bouncing off the walls and echoing back to her, distorting, making it impossible to tell if she was truly speaking aloud or if her mind was playing tricks. The ship responded with its usual silence, heavy, suffocating, an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow her words whole. Lira felt the pressure building in her chest again, the weight of the tomb's oppressive influence crushing her spirit. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were twisting and warping, feeding into the tomb's desires. Every moment she spent on this ship, she could feel herself slipping, losing the grip she had on reality. Still, she had to keep moving. She had to find Tarek. She had to find a way to break free. The darkness before her shifted, and her gaze flickered to the end, the corridor. There, standing just beyond the reach of the weak light, was a figure, a shape, indistinct and almost imperceptible. Lira froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was so still, so utterly quiet, that it might have been just another shadow, or a trick of her mind. But there was something that pulled at her, beckoning her closer. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step forward, and then another. As she drew closer, the figure became clearer. No longer a distant shadow, but a man. He stood perfectly still, his face obscured by a hood, his body wrapped in tattered, moth-eaten clothing. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. This figure wasn't real. It couldn't be. The tomb had created it, a manifestation designed to confuse her, to break her down. But still, something about him felt strangely familiar. The way he stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for her to approach. "Who are you?" Lira asked, her voice a strained whisper. The figure did not move. Her heart raced in her chest, the silence between them stretching endlessly. Lira reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against the cold metal wall as she tried to steady herself. Was this the end? Was this figure another reflection, another part of the tomb's twisted, fractured reality? The figure finally stirred. Slowly, his head turned toward her, his face still hidden in shadow. But as he moved, Lira felt an unnatural sense of dread wash over her. The figure wasn't moving like a person. It was gliding, shifting as though it wasn't quite real, its limbs stretching unnaturally. Then it spoke. "The ship calls you." The voice was distorted, broken, a faint whisper that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. Lyra's breath caught. The ship. Did the figure mean the tomb? Did it mean the eclipse? She didn't know, but it was clear now that this was no ordinary manifestation. This was something deeper, something more twisted. The tomb had made this figure for her, to pull her deeper into its grasp. "What do you want from me?" Lira demanded, stepping back, her voice rising with desperation. The figure tilted its head slightly, and then the hooded shape seemed to shift again, becoming more fluid, more unnatural. It didn't respond with words, but it didn't need to. The silence that followed was suffocating, and the weight of its presence pressed in on her chest. The corridor seemed to stretch longer, the walls closing in, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. In its place, only darkness. Lira stood frozen for several long moments. The tomb was playing with her. That much was clear now. The voices, the illusions, the strange figures. It was all designed to break her, to make her question her own mind. She spun on her heels, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. She couldn't let herself be drawn in by these manifestations. Not now. Not when Tarek was still out there. She had to keep moving. But as she turned the corner, she was struck by something she hadn't expected. A sudden blinding light. An explosion of searing, cold brilliance that flooded the hallway ahead of her. The light was so intense that for a moment she thought she might be blind. When the light finally dimmed, she found herself standing in a new room, vast, towering, a chamber unlike any she had seen before on the Eclipse. Its walls were carved, with symbols she didn't recognize, their forms twisting in unnatural angles. The floor beneath her feet was a strange, polished black stone, so smooth it seemed to shimmer in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a large altar, its surface covered in ancient symbols, worn by time but still potent with power. Lira stepped forward, instinctively drawn to it. She had no idea what it was, but something in the air felt different here. The weight of the ship's influence seemed weakened, almost as though she had crossed into some new, unexplored part of the tomb. There was something else here, though. Something darker. Lira felt the presence again. A force, ancient and malevolent, watching her. Her heart raced. She wasn't alone. Chapter 8. The Heart of the Tomb. The light was blinding, but it wasn't like the glare of a star. No, this light was colder, its edges sharp and cruel. It filled the chamber like a silent storm, heavy with something far more ominous than mere, radiance. Lira blinked, trying to adjust, but the brightness was disorienting, swallowing her whole. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, sending ripples through the black stone floor. Her eyes darted around, searching for some clue as to what was happening. The room was vast, stretching farther than she could see, the walls disappearing, into a darkness so thick it could have swallowed the entire galaxy. But there was no escape here. The weight of the ship's presence was pressing down on her once again, suffocating, wrapping around her lungs like a cold, unseen hand. And then she saw it, standing in the center of the room. A massive altar, its surface etched with symbols, so ancient they seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The air around it hummed, vibrating with power, as if the very stones of the Eclipse were alive, breathing, watching. The altar was like nothing she had ever seen before. There were no typical markings, no familiar iconography. Instead, the symbols twisted in unnatural patterns, bending in on themselves, defying the laws of physics. They seemed to move when she wasn't looking, rearranging themselves, like they were somehow alive. Lira stepped cautiously toward it, each footfall echoing in the vast, silent chamber. The light flickered for a moment, casting strange, elongated shadows across the floor, creating shapes that lurked just out of the corner of her vision. Her pulse quickened. The room felt like it was closing in on her, walls inching ever closer, tightening around her chest. What is this place? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. She wasn't expecting an answer. She never expected an answer. But the question still hung in the air, thick with uncertainty, with an unspoken fear. She reached the altar and ran her fingers over its surface. The symbols seemed to react to her touch, glowing faintly, as though they recognized her presence. They pulsed beneath her fingertips, warm and cold at once, sending a shiver down her spine. The hum in the room grew louder, and then something stirred. Lira jerked back, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone in this room anymore. A figure emerged from the shadows, slowly, deliberately, as if it were part of the darkness itself. Its shape was tall and slender, and though she couldn't see its face, she could feel its eyes on her. Cold. Predatory. It stepped forward and the air seemed to ripple around it. It wasn't human. Nothing about it was. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting like a mirage, its body flickering in and out of existence as if the very fabric of reality could not hold it. The figure spoke, its voice deep and resonant, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, vibrating the stones beneath her feet. "You are not meant to be here." Lira froze. She had heard the voice before, faintly, in the back of her mind. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the corridors, the same presence that had tried to pull her under. The figure's shape seemed to blur and stretch as it advanced, becoming more defined with each step. its form taking on a semblance. Human-like features, but with something alien, something twisted lurking beneath. "You are no longer a guest," it continued, the voice growing darker, more menacing. "You are part of the tomb. It claims all who enter." Lyra's blood ran cold as the words sank in. "No!" She forced the word out through clenched teeth. "I won't be part of it." The figure tilted its head, its eyes, or what passed, for eyes, focusing on her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. There was a horrible familiarity about it, something in the way it moved, the way it spoke, that made her heart pound in her chest. "You think you can fight it?" the figure said, its voice dripping with scorn. "You think you can escape? There is no escape from the tomb. It devours all." Lira backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out of here. She had to find Tarek. He was out there somewhere, trapped in this hellish maze of shifting corridors and haunted spaces. But the figure was blocking her way, its form growing larger, more imposing, as if it could swallow her whole. "I don't have time for this," she muttered to herself. "I have to keep moving." But the figure wasn't done. "You are not as strong as you think," it said, its voice darkly amused. "The tomb will break you, just as it has broken the others. You are nothing but a flicker, a fleeting moment in the endless void." Lyra's breath came in shallow gasps. It was right, in a way. She was nothing. No one in the vastness of the universe. Just a speck of dust, insignificant. But that thought only fueled her anger. She wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. She glanced toward the altar. The symbols on it had begun to glow brighter, pulsating with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. There was something there, something she had missed before, something that might be able to help her understand this place. The figure reached out for her, its hand stretching toward her like a shadow. It's too late. With a flash of instinct, Lira spun away, rushing toward the altar. She didn't know why she did it, but she knew it was the only chance she had. The tomb had tried to break her at every turn, and it wouldn't stop now. But she wasn't going to just let it consume her. She reached the altar and placed her hands on its surface. The symbols pulsed more intensely, and the hum in the air grew louder, as if the very core of the ship was waking up, responding to her presence. The figure let out a sound, half scream, half growl, as it surged forward. "No!" Lyra's fingers pressed harder against the altar, her palms burning with an intense heat. She could feel the power coursing through her, surging like an electric current, wrapping itself around her, binding her to the ship. And then, with a sudden, blinding flash of light, everything went dark. Chapter 9. The Depths of the Eclipse. The darkness was overwhelming. Lira had never experienced silence like this. Not in the cold void of space, not in the deepest caverns of abandoned stations. This was different. This was an oppressive silence. A weight on her chest, a force pressing against her very soul. The blackness stretched for infinity. No walls, no ground beneath her feet, no air to breathe. It felt like she was suspended in nothingness, adrift in an ocean with no shore, no current to guide her, only the suffocating stillness. Her head swam as she tried to gather her thoughts. The sudden darkness after the blinding flash of light had thrown her off balance. She reached out, but her fingers met nothing. No walls, no altar, no comforting shapes or familiar sounds. The only thing that remained was that gnawing, creeping feeling. The tomb was here. She could feel it. It was watching. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind struggling to comprehend where she was. She had been standing before the altar, pressing her hands against its surface when the light had erupted. And now she was somewhere else. Somewhere between reality and nightmare. The ship was alive. She had always known that, in some instinctual way, but now it felt like the tomb was far more than just a collection of corridors and abandoned halls. It was a consciousness, a presence. It had waited for her, drawn her here, and now it was playing its game, its twisted game. Her breath quickened as panic began to claw at her chest. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let it take control of her. Not again. The tomb had tried to break her before, and it would continue trying until she was no more than a fragment of herself, a shadow of the woman who had first boarded this cursed ship. She forced her breath to slow, trying to focus on what was real, what was tangible, but the silence continued to wrap around her, suffocating her thoughts. She could feel it now, something moving, lurking in the darkness, something that didn't belong. Tarek. Her voice broke the silence, but it sounded distant, as if the words had been swallowed by the vastness of the empty space around her. There was no answer, no echo, only that same oppressive stillness. She tried again, louder this time. Tarek! Still nothing. Her heart pounded harder in her chest, and a flash of guilt flared in her mind. What if he wasn't alive? What if she had lost him already, consumed by the ship like so many before? Her thoughts spiraled, but she couldn't afford to be weak. She had a job to do. She had to survive. She had to find him. Her eyes flickered open, or at least she thought they did. The darkness around her wasn't simply void. It was alive, changing. She could sense it now, the edges of her vision warping as though reality itself were bending, twisting. The tomb was shifting once again. Then, a flicker of light appeared, a distant glimmer that seemed to stretch toward her. Lira took a hesitant step forward, but as her foot hit the ground, she realized that she was no longer on solid footing. The floor was gone, replaced by a shifting, undulating surface that moved beneath her like liquid, pulling her down, threatening to swallow her whole. She stumbled, her arms flailing as she tried to steady herself. What was happening? Where was she? Where was the altar? The room had changed. The ship had changed. Suddenly the darkness parted, just for a moment, and Lira saw something she hadn't expected. A vision of Tarek, standing at the far end of the corridor, his back turned to her. His form was a silhouette against a backdrop of flickering lights, and for a brief moment Lira thought she could hear his voice calling to her, but it was distorted, barely audible over the hum of the ship. Tarek! She moved forward, stumbling in the strange, liquid-like space beneath her feet. Every step felt like it took her farther away from him, and yet closer at the same time. The closer she got, the more the ship's influence seemed to intensify. Whispers crept into her mind, promises of darkness, of obliteration. She pushed through it, determined. He had to be there. She had to reach him. With every step, the image of Tarek grew clearer. She could see his features now, his strong jawline, his wild hair, and the way he stood, rigid, almost lifeless. Tarek, what's happening? Lira called out, her voice growing more frantic, but he didn't turn. The closer she got, the farther he seemed to retreat. Suddenly the ship groaned, its structure shuddering violently, sending Lira crashing to the ground. She gasped as the liquid-like surface beneath her transformed once more, this time becoming jagged, sharp, like thousands of thorns rising up from the darkness. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but before she could move, the air shifted. A loud crack echoed through the chamber, and the floor beneath her splintered, splitting wide open. Lira cried out as the ground gave way, sending her plummeting into the abyss. She fell, her body weightless, disoriented, spiraling into the unknown. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching out before her until, with a sudden brutal impact, her body slammed against something solid. Her vision blurred, but she could still see the faint outline of Tarek, standing on the edge of the darkness, unreachable. And then she woke. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if she was still falling, or if the world around her had simply shifted once again. She lay on the cold, smooth surface of the Eclipse, gasping for air. Her chest rose and fell with each desperate breath, but she wasn't alone. This time, the figure, the one that had been tormenting her, was standing in front of her now. Its form was clearer, more real, and its eyes, black, empty voids, stared down at her with a sense of disdain. "You think you can escape," the figure said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "But the tomb claims all. It is inevitable." Lyra's body trembled as she pushed herself to her feet. her legs weak beneath her. She couldn't let this creature get to her. She couldn't let the tomb take her mind. "Where's Tarek?" she demanded, her voice raw and desperate. The figure tilted its head, a slow, mocking motion that sent chills down her spine. "Tarek is nothing. The tomb consumes all, whether you wish it or not. You will be forgotten just like the others." "No," Lira whispered, shaking her head fiercely. "I won't be forgotten. I won't let it take me." The figure laughed, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. "The ship. You are already lost," it said, its voice chillingly calm. "And so is he." With a flick of its hand, the figure summoned a wave of shadows that engulfed Lira, pulling her down into the depths of the Eclipse. The shadows wrapped around her, suffocating, pulling her deeper into the ship's heart. But just as quickly as the darkness came, it faded, and Lira was left standing at the threshold of an empty room, a room filled with memories she had long buried. A sudden flash of understanding hit her. The tomb didn't just warp reality. It was tapping into her memories, her fears, her doubts. The ship was manipulating her, pulling at the very fabric of her being, distorting everything she had ever known. And in this room, this chamber of memories, she realized something even more terrifying. She was never alone. Chapter 10. The Final Eclipse. The chamber was suffocating. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest, the sound echoing against the cold walls of the room. Every breath felt like it was being pulled from her lungs, every second a battle against the crushing weight of the ship's influence. She was alone now, but it didn't feel like it. The presence of the tomb was everywhere. It wasn't just a ship. It was a living, breathing force that had woven itself into her mind, into her very soul. She could feel its pull, its whispers. They murmured to her, soft and insistent, like the voice of a lover. "Come closer," it whispered. "Let me show you what lies beyond." But she knew better. She had to fight this. She had to break free. The tomb had taken so much already, her crew, her hope, her peace of mind. But it would not take her. Not now. Not ever. Her eyes scanned the room, the walls pulsating with energy, warping and shifting as if they were alive. The ship was testing, her once more, pushing her to the brink. The darkness that enveloped the space seemed to shift and twist with a mind of its own, pulling at the edges of reality. She stepped forward, her legs heavy, her mind clouded with exhaustion. Each movement felt like it took an eternity. The very air seemed to drag her down, like a suffocating weight pressing on her chest. Yet, she pushed forward. "Tarek!" Her voice was weak, but she didn't care. She had to find him. The ship's influence had tried to warp her mind, to confuse her sense of reality. But she would not give in. The room around her shifted once again. The walls, once solid and unyielding, seemed to melt into the air, transforming into something more fluid, more alien. Lyra's pulse quickened as she realized where she was. This was no ordinary space. It was the heart of the tomb, the core of the ship. The room hummed with ancient power, a force that seemed to resonate from every crack in the walls. Then, before her, a figure materialized out of the darkness. She gasped as she recognized it. Tarek? But the man standing before her was not the Tarek she had known. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt and pale. The light of life had been drained from him, leaving only a shadow of who he had once been. The man before her was an echo, a twisted reflection of the person she loved. "Tarek," she repeated, taking a step closer. The figure's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. It was a smile that spoke of death and despair. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice a hollow mockery of Tarek's own. It was as though the tomb had contorted his voice, turning it into something alien, something grotesque. "Tarek," Lira whispered, shaking her head, refusing to believe that the man she cared for had become this thing. "It's too late for you," the figure said again. "The tomb has already claimed you." Lyra's heart twisted in her chest as she struggled to hold on to the fragments of herself that were slipping away. Was this really him? Had the tomb consumed him entirely? She couldn't afford to doubt. She couldn't let it take her, too. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice rising with determination. "I'll fight. I'll fight to the end." The figure's eyes darkened. "You don't understand. This isn't a fight you can win. It's already too late for you." The room trembled around them as if the very walls were closing in on her. Lira's mind raced as she realized what the figure was trying to tell her. The tomb was not just a ship, it was a force that consumed everything it touched, shaping the lives of those it claimed into its own distorted image. Her thoughts drifted back to her earlier encounters, the whispers, the shifting halls, the hallucinations. It was all part of the ship's plan. It had always been about control, about making her question herself, about driving her to despair. But no, she wasn't going to give in. She couldn't. Let it win. "You're not Tarek," she said firmly, shaking her head. "You're just another illusion." The figure tilted its head, its expression frozen in that twisted smile. "You can't outrun the inevitable, Lira." Her pulse raced, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward the figure. She knew it was a lie. She knew that the real Tarek was out there somewhere beyond the ship's reach. Suddenly, the figure lunged at her, but she was ready. The light around them flared, bright and painful. As she summoned everything she had left, she gripped the power of the tomb, refusing to let it consume her any longer. The ship had tried to claim her, to claim everything, but she was not its puppet. She was not its plaything. The figure screamed, its form disintegrating into a cloud of shadows and light. It wasn't Tarek. It had never been him. It was just another fragment of the ship's power, a reflection of her own fears. With the figure gone, the room seemed to settle, the trembling walls falling still. But the presence of the tomb remained, its weight, its pressure. It was still, here, still watching, and Lira realized then that the only way to escape it, to break free, was to destroy it. The altar, the ancient power. The ship was built on something far older than anything she could comprehend. It had claimed so many before her, but not her, not today. With trembling hands, she turned back toward the altar. It was the source of the tomb's power, the wellspring from which all of this darkness had flowed. If she could destroy it, she could destroy the ship. And if she could destroy the ship, she could set everything free. The walls groaned as she approached the altar. The hum of the ship grew louder, and Lira felt the very air thickening, pulling her in. She was almost there, just a little more, but before she could reach the altar, her voice whispered to her, faint but clear. It was the voice of her own doubt, of her own fears. "You can't do it. You'll never win. It's too powerful." She stopped. She could feel it then, the pull of the tomb trying to drag her into its grasp. It was trying to break her once more. But this time Lira didn't flinch. She didn't falter. "This ends now," she whispered to herself. With every ounce of strength she pushed forward. She had nothing left to lose. Her body shook as she placed her hands on the altar. The symbols on its surface flared to life, glowing brightly, but instead of retreating, Lira pushed harder, focusing every bit of her energy on the source of the tomb's power. The altar began to crack, the symbols warping and twisting in ways they should never have been able to. Light flooded the room, blinding, blazing, overwhelming. The ship screamed in fury as its ancient power was torn apart from within. For a moment, Lira felt herself being pulled toward the darkness, toward the void. But she fought against it. She could feel the strength of her will, of her defiance, pushing against the force that had tried to claim her. With one final surge of energy, the altar shattered, its power erupting in a wave of light and sound that ripped through the tomb. The walls trembled and cracked, and the ship let out a final, agonized scream. Lira collapsed to her knees, her strength gone, but the tomb was silent. The force that had haunted her, that had manipulated her every step, was gone. The ship was still. It was over. Epilogue. A new dawn. The stars outside the shattered windows of the Eclipse gleamed like distant beacons, unaffected by the dark struggles that had unfolded within the ship. The tomb was no more. Its influence, its haunting whispers, had faded into the cold silence of space. The once oppressive walls now stood still, a hollow shell of a place that had once sought to consume everything within it. Lira stood by the window, staring out into the vast expanse. Her breath was steady, her mind quiet. But the weight of everything she had endured still lingered in her chest. She could feel it, the emptiness, the loss, the silence of a ship once full of nightmares. Tarek's absence was a void in her heart, one she would carry with her always. She had failed to save him from the tomb, and that pain would never fully fade. But she had succeeded in something greater. She had survived. She had freed herself from the ship's grip, even when everything seemed lost. The stars outside seemed brighter now, more alive, as though they were welcoming her into the unknown. The eclipse, in all its twisted, haunted glory, had finally succumbed to its own destruction. It was over, but Lira knew her journey wasn't done. There was still so much to see, so much to understand. The galaxy stretched out before her, a vast canvas, and for the first time in a long while she felt a sense of freedom. As she turned away from the window, the sound of the ship's systems beginning to hum back to life filled the air. The repairs would take time, but there was a sense of hope now, a possibility for a future that she hadn't allowed herself to believe in before. The tomb of the forgotten stars had claimed many, but it would not claim her. Not anymore. With a final glance at the ruins of the ship that had once been her prison, Lira set her gaze forward. The stars were waiting, and she was ready. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Let me know in the comments what ideas you would like the next story to be about. Please leave a thumbs up, share, subscribe, comment.